If you're going to do a deal, everyone has to own the decision to do a deal. I think it's really critical for the company when you're pursuing something to do that. I think the downside of not having alignment is, 1 or 2 years post acquisition close, when things may not be going as well as you thought, or you're not hitting the targets you thought you were going to hit, is when and people can say, well, I didn't want to do that deal in the first place, or I was never into it. That's a bad outcome. That's not what you want. You want people to be aligned up front and own either the good or bad that happens post close, and take accountability for that. And so that's why I think the alignment up front is important, so that there's no necessary finger pointing or anything like that after.
Welcome to M&A Science, where we curate knowledge from the best in M&A to continuously improve. If you're interested in keeping up with the latest from M&A Science, subscribe to our free newsletter at mascience.com. Every week we share highlights from our interviews, invitations to events, M&A role openings, and other resources as we build the greatest community of forward-thinking M&A practitioners. Again, that's mascience.com. I'm your host, Kison, Patel, CEO and founder of M&A Science. Joining me today is Veena Ramaswamy, Head of Corporate Development at Lemonade. Lemonade offers renters insurance, homeowners insurance, car insurance, pet insurance, and term life insurance. Probably going to be a customer after this interview. Traded on NYSE under LMND. Today we're going to talk about how and why you should start a corporate development function. Veena, how are you doing today?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing good. Thanks for taking the time to chat with me. Can we kick things off with a little bit about your background?
Sure. Sounds good. So at a high level, my background is in strategy, corporate development, and investment banking. I've always had the goal of using strategic finance and M&A to drive company growth. The first half of my career was in investment banking and strategy at Morgan Stanley. I joined Morgan Stanley right out of college, spent a few years in banking, then went and got my MBA, and then came back to Morgan Stanley for more fun and was in the internal strategy and M&A team, where we worked with Morgan Stanley executives and the board there on strategy, acquisitions, divestitures, joint ventures. And the second half of my career has been in operating roles in growth stage tech companies, in fintech and insurtech specifically. Had a variety of operating roles, including special projects, GMing a business, strategic partnerships, and corporate development.
So I'm curious, because I see a lot of folks that go from investment banking into corporate development, but you've got this operational background blended into it. Can you give me a sense of how those skills particularly help with the corporate development practice, and just trying to get a sense of that gap from somebody that goes straight from banking into corporate development versus you getting the blend of both and then getting to corporate development?
Sure. I think, investment banking has the core skill set on, deal execution, evaluation, et cetera. I think for me, the operating experience was really valuable, now for me as a corporate development professional, in that really getting to understand how a business is run is only, I feel, truly done by actually being in that seat and actually having to launch a new product, create a new, funding mechanism or other kind of key strategic initiatives for a business. And by truly running those and creating those for a business is how you understand how the business operates. In a corporate development seat, the success of a lot of M&A deals is really from the operational execution and the post-deal signing, deal closing integration. And so I think having had that operational experience, it gives me a unique perspective on and really appreciating and understanding those pieces and ensuring those are set in motion long before the deal closes.
So the hypothesis actually comes to fruition.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, let's kick things off with why should companies start a corporate development function?
Sure. I'd start by saying a lot of early to growth stage companies don't actually have a corporate development function. They typically have an ad hoc process that activates when a company executive receives an inbound from a company to acquire them. And oftentimes not much materializes from these conversations. I think the reason to formalize and create a corporate development function is really ingrained by the founders and executives. And if they view corporate development or acquisitions as a tool that's valuable for growth in their business. A way to figure this out is to answer three key questions as an executive is first, obviously, is there a need? The second is, okay, if there's a need, do I need to hire for this? And then the third is, who do I hire for this? And I guess on the first piece of establishing, is there a need? I think it's really important to have alignment with the founders and executives around M&A as a tool to drive growth. As I mentioned, growth through M&A can be to achieve one of three things: accelerating, strengthening, or protecting the business. For accelerating the business, this is current or future business goals or objectives, growth in existing products, adding adjacent products, speed to market. In terms of strengthening, this can add capabilities that strengthen the value of your current or future product offerings. This can be anything from tech, licenses, talent, people, and then protecting the business. M&A can also be used to protect against competitive threats or market movements. And so I think if an executive and founding team believes in one of those three things as a way to or as a tool for growth in your business, then I think it's important that this function is established.
Is there like a certain size that you think is ideal to even consider M&A as a function?
That's a good question. I don't necessarily think there's a hard and fast rule of X amount of funding or X number of people. I think it's, really as if you have at least one established product and product market fit, and you've achieved some semblance of scale, and you're thinking about growth, whether it be in that product, different geographies, different distribution, or additional products, I think that's when you can start thinking about establishing this as a function. But I think once you have to really establish that core product and have some growth and success in that product.
And I like how you framed it previously around accelerating, strengthening, and protecting. Is there a threshold where you go from some of these founder-led acquisitions to here's a point we should really stand this up as a function and have somebody lead it?
I think when the targets you're starting to look at are larger scaled businesses. So if you've reached scale yourself, like I said, whether it be number of customers or volume in your core product, and you're starting to look at companies at or potentially even larger than you, but for some reason there's an opportunity to acquire them, I think that's when you should start thinking about bringing somebody in to help run and lead this process for you. And I think the more complicated the business that you're acquiring is, and whether or not the business is public as well, I think creates a lot of complexities that it's important to have somebody, I think, in-house to manage and run that process for you versus it being a part-time job for another executive.
Bigger deals get more complicated.
Yes.
What are the benefits of a corporate development function?
Yeah, I think, the biggest benefit, I think, is that it can allow a company to turn around from being reactive to things that come their way to start thinking proactively about opportunities, getting ahead of companies that may not necessarily be quote unquote for sale that you think of and you see, as a strategic asset for your business to own, and reaching out to those companies. I think that's where some of the best deals get done, is when it's not necessarily a company that's reached out to you and is telling you they want to be bought, but is when you're proactively looking at an opportunity and developing that conversation and then hopefully opportunity with the business.
Yeah, I like that a lot because as the executive leadership, you can only reach out to so many companies. And if you've got this laid out strategy, identify more targets, now you actually got more bandwidth or folks to reach out to those companies.
Exactly.
Any other benefits?
Yeah, I think there's a value to, I would add to having this function internally versus, sometimes you can rely on external advisors or consultants or bankers and some of your venture capitalists on your board. But I think the value in having this function internally is really, no one appreciates and understands your business, I think, as well as somebody internally at your company. And the incentives are different. As a former banker, I understand the incentives of bankers quite well, and they're motivated to get a deal done. And that's just how their business works. Whereas if you have this function internally and someone owning it internally, they're an employee of your company. They're not motivated by the number of deals they get done and how quickly they can get them done. They're motivated on driving growth for your business.
So their motivators are very much aligned with the broader company's goals and
exactly.
Success. When it comes to reviewing this activity, M&A is becoming core part of the strategy for growth. When an organization start deciding to build out this function, how does that work? Is that seated through the CEO specifically? Is it weighted in through the board to do that? Like, where does that really originate from?
Typically, I've seen it's usually from a CEO or executive team member who either seeing inbounds come through or they're seeing opportunities that are potentially being missed and realizing that it can't be a part-time thing for, various executives to pinch it, and that there should be some centralizing mechanism and some expertise brought into as well to lead these for your business. But the CEO is always usually involved in the hiring process and in a lot of these acquisitions as well, of course.
Then what happens? Is there a formal approval to get the board to say okay to this? Is there, are we building a business plan to set up a corp dev function? Do we need to allocate capital to it?
It really depends. I've seen kind of all different versions of this. There's not necessarily a formal, it depends. Some companies might have a formal M&A strategy that the board approves, and we want to go after X targets by this year. I've heard companies say, we want to buy 10 companies next year. I don't necessarily agree with that approach myself. I think that's just focusing on, is like I was saying a little bit on, like kind of a bit more of a banker mentality of let me see how many deals I can get done versus actually thinking about what's valuable for the business. There might be a year which you get no deals done. And that's something that as a corporate development professional, well, one, you have to be okay with, but two, realize that that's getting a deal done is not always the best thing for the business. And so I would say it depends. In terms of the, you mentioned the, dollar allocation from a board, it really depends. Typically for M&A, that doesn't happen. Usually you align at a high level on the currency in which you're willing and wanting to acquire companies with, cash, stock, what the typical split will look like, what you're comfortable with depending on market conditions. But typically there's no hard and fast rules, because as these M&A processes evolve, both sides need to be a bit nimble if you want to get a deal done. And so I haven't typically seen a hard and fast rule in terms of that. In terms of if you're doing investing, of course, there might be a bit more of those of a pool of money allocated towards it. But for, I would say, pure M&A, it's typically opportunistic.
A lot of variables. It's not like there's a M&A function, a box kit out there that gives you all these parameters to build out this function.
Yeah, no, there's not.
Yeah, even with the capital too, because like you mentioned, there's a lot of ways you structure deals, and there's variances there as well.
Yeah. And then even within that, I would add, like, depending on the type of business you're acquiring and, the executives at the target business, and there's different ways to structure even the deals from a, short-term versus long-term incentive package. And so there's a lot of nuances in options, I would say.
You ready to get into the fun stuff? You're going to teach me how to actually do this step by step?
Sure. Let's do it.
All right. Where do we start?
Sure. So like we were saying, there's no like specific, toolkit on how to do this. But for me, I have a little playbook on how I think about setting up these functions and what's worked for me in the past. I would say there are, 4 key things that I've done. The first is, just getting to know the business really well. This begins with laying out the 3 to 5 year strategic roadmap and playing it back to the founders, key executives, and aligning on where there might be opportunity in the next few years to, accelerate, strengthen, or protect certain parts of the business. I think the important piece here also is getting feedback and refreshing this. This is not a one-time set in stone thing or exercise that happens or should happen. It should be an iterative process that evolves over time, and that you keep revisiting. The second piece I would say is about establishing a process and making people aware of that process. I think M&A deals, as we just discussed, are complicated. There's so many different decision points and that need to be made along the way. So I think the first most important thing you can do is just lay out what the deal steps and process looks like. Who are the stakeholders that need to be involved? What does a typical timeline look like? What approvals are needed? Board, potentially shareholder approval if you're a public company, or if your target is a public company, and And then establishing, for as part of that process, what's the criteria you have for both evaluating inbounds and then pursuing external opportunities or pursuing outbounds? What would meet your threshold to kick off that timeline and that process? And then, like I said, the most important part of this all is just making sure people are aware of this process and how that works, so that it's very clear how this works for the business. The third piece I would say is I've called this historically being an information hub. And really what that means is just being in the flow. I think, knowing the latest about what companies in your space are doing, what companies adjacent to your space are doing, talking with VCs, investors, bankers, other industry participants. And that really allows you to not just react to things. Again, it's just to start becoming more proactive on opportunities when you're starting to not just hear the color, but develop a point of view and a perspective on some of these companies and these businesses. And then I think important again is to socialize this, not just with the executives, but is to interact with people across your organization. There are various functions within a company that are talking with customers and vendors and partners all day long. And they can sometimes be really good sources of information or deal sourcing, frankly, and sharing market color on competitors and things like that. And so staying plugged in with folks across your business as well in some of these key roles, I think is really important. And I would consider part of this being an information hub. And then the last piece I would say is, in setting up this function is just really helping people realize that not every opportunity is a deal. People get very excited at the prospect of acquiring a business. And sometimes that excitement can lead to speeding through or bypassing some of the criteria or diligence you've established, processes that you're trying to, keep in place or that you need to have in order to move forward. And so I think it's the job of a corporate development lead to be that sounding board and reminder, what your criteria and your process is, and hold people to it.
Would you say that's like knocking out deal fever or trying to, I don't know, what's the right word for
it?
A
little bit, I would say maybe taming deal fever. Don't get me wrong. I also get excited at the prospect of doing a deal and getting a deal done. But I think it's, my role uniquely to just make sure that that doesn't cloud our judgment on other things.
So maybe alignment's a better word.
Yeah.
Say alignment sort of across your stakeholders.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay. I was thinking about this too. Your background, you were in that corporate development realm at Morgan Stanley. And then, which is assuming pretty mature as an organization. And then you're involved 2 times in terms of standing up an M&A function.
Yeah.
Okay. And this is where I want to make that point, because there's a lot of folks that come from the mature function into that startup realm to stand up an M&A function. We talked about there's no real playbook on it. We're working on publishing a book called How to Stand Up an M&A Function. So this is highly relevant to it. And these steps align with that. So let's take these apart, starting with the first one, when your step one is basically doing diligence on the company, understanding that 3 to 5 year roadmap. And like you mentioned, regurgitating it back to that executive team, getting feedback, trying to see if there's a refresh needed. Tell me more, like how do you do that properly?
Yeah. So it really, I think, is a bit of, coming in first to the company and really engaging not just with the kind of C-level executive team, but I would say the business leads and functional leads under that layer as well, to really understand, get under the vision, the product, the target customer, how you make money, what are things that are interesting to these various stakeholders in terms of growth, and how do they see themselves achieving their growth targets in the kind of ensuing year or year plus and longer term. Oftentimes, as I was mentioning before, also a lot of these folks they're the ones that are seeing what's out there in terms of technology development, things that make in our case, underwriting or, claims more efficient, or, capabilities that might enhance some of our offerings today. And so I think really, spending time with them and understanding what their function is and what drives their growth is really important. And then I think this probably goes without saying, but, really understanding your company model. and how your economics work, and where the growth in the business is going to be from going forward. And I think having a good sense of that, of course, will only enhance how you're thinking about opportunities that could add to your business.
I'm trying to get a sense if I'm somebody that's maybe coming from banking, just entering corporate development, or coming up through a business function into M&A. What you described is very much the strategy thinking. And maybe if I haven't been exposed to that, how do I wrap my head around that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say you have to enter kind of, if, depending on the business you're in, if you have experience in that industry or not. I think you have to be just a knowledge seeker and somebody who's curious and eager to learn. You have to go in a bit humbly too, and to kind of soak in all the information from the experts in your business. And I would say also, there aren't a lot of dumb questions, or you shouldn't feel like there are a lot of dumb questions, because you really need to get to the bottom of some of these core pieces of the business. And I think going in and asking a ton of questions, and getting your becoming an expert on some of these areas is really important for a corporate development professional. I didn't have insurance experience before I joined Lemonade, and I had to, I quickly ramped to understand the ins and outs of our business. And I think that's just part of the kind of personality and background too of some of these corporate development professionals, is that you're intellectually curious. You want to learn and get to the bottom of how a business works, how you can optimize it. And I think that's also, to some extent, investment banking training. You have to really dig into a company to understand how it works. And so I think you bring that to in-house, and you take that kind of learning point of view, and from all these, discussions, and then, materials that you're reviewing as well.
So if I want to talk to a business leader, try to understand the business, I'm new to my corp dev role or trying to stand it up. What could you give me, like a real an outline of how, what are the key things I want to touch on to make sure I'm getting the information I should be getting from those conversations?
Yeah, depending on the role of, if it's like a GM of a business, or a functional leader. I would say if it's a GM type of person, is really understanding what their product is that they're managing. I think a big part of this is you yourself going through the user experience, and testing out the product experience online, so what the actual product is. I think also it's understanding what their objectives and their OKRs are for the year, and go forward. A lot of times these GMs will also say, in 3 years, I want to be at X position, and I want to offer, Y products as well. And they're usually very forward thinking. And so getting insight into that is very important. And I think that really starts with just understanding what their goals and objectives are, and what the actual product is. For functional leaders, I think it's a bit more, I think it's important to ask what their OKRs are, and what their goals are for the year. But I think it's also really important for them to understand what's interesting for them. What are some cool things happening out there? And by this, I mean, when I talk to our head of data science and AI, I want to know what are some cool technologies out there that he thinks are interesting. And then, going and either learning them myself, or learning from him, what is compelling, or what could be compelling for us. And so developing that understanding of what key functionalities that can, be helpful for your business going forward, I think is really important. And that's, again, just like having a learning mindset, and trying to learn, even if you don't have the experience in, machine learning or AI, getting smart about it quickly, whether through internal resources or external resources.
Are there any like hidden gems of people that could be valuable resources that may be overlooked for a newcomer?
I would say it's, the surprising, I wouldn't call this necessarily surprising, but I think you can get a lot of really helpful information from maybe some of the partnerships of folks in your growth team. They're having conversations, and they're seeing certain companies take off, or in terms of ad spend, or they're just seeing trends in the market that I think are helpful to hear. That's not necessarily a surprising role that's helpful. But I think one of the ones that I guess are not as intuitive, I think a lot of times people, especially with investment banking backgrounds, will, talk to the finance team, and talk to other finance professionals. But I think, like I was mentioning, I've found some of the most interesting conversations to be with our head of data science or R&D team, folks that I may not have had the experience interacting with before. So it can be, a little bit maybe for folks daunting because they don't necessarily speak the same language. But I think those are the most interesting and illuminating conversations you can have.
What's the intro script like when you want to reach out to introduce yourself? Because maybe they don't know of, maybe they saw a little announcement of this new head of Corp Dev and they don't even know what that is. How do you reach out and make that introduction to get that conversation going?
Yeah, I think it's just a quick intro of, who you are. People don't necessarily know what corp dev means, as, just the words corporate development. It's kind of a vague terminology for a function if you don't actually know what it can mean and that it means M&A. But, just sharing with them that you joined and what your mandate is and how you wanted just to get to learn what they're doing and what's interesting for them. Most folks will always take an intro conversation at least, and are excited. Like I said, M&A can be very exciting for companies. And so I never really face much pushback. I think people usually want to talk and share their thoughts and share where their ideas are.
So we get the strategy, lay of the land. Is there any deliverable that comes out of this strategy part? Or, the sort of diligence we're doing on the company to get that started?
I think that's a good question. It really, there's no set in stone thing, but for me, what works is, having a synthesis or a document where I have my thoughts on, not just absorbing and understanding these conversations, but I think really important is to have my perspective or point of view of where there are opportunities. Sometimes this can manifest itself, and I've done this before, of a SWOT analysis, strength, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So once you do your kind of evaluation of the business and talking to all the key stakeholders, playing back how you see the again strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats for the business, and that's somewhat of a centralizing document that you obviously can iterate from and go from. But that's a good way for me to have synthesized this in the past.
How big of a document do you end up
with? It really depends. I like to keep things in, very simple and efficient. I think, you can always have 100-page documents or 100-page decks, but who reads them? Who reads and who has the time for that? And so I'm usually very much a one-pager type of person of here's the synthesis. And then obviously there's supporting materials as needed, but I try to keep it as efficient as possible, especially if I'm sharing it with other folks too, playing it back to them.
And then from here, we're going to document a process.
This is a very, from my perspective, it's a kind of simple one pager. And what I've done before of just outlining what the steps are to get a deal done. I think it's very helpful for folks who haven't gone through an M&A process in particular to see, that there's an initial piece of, evaluation, and then there's usually a letter of intent or some type of term sheet. And then there's, further diligence, and then there's, alignment and on pricing and negotiating. And then there's various, checkpoints with the board as well. And then obviously before a formal offer is typically made, you need board approval. And so just simply stating those and outlining those steps in the process, I think is important. I think, key to this and why I think it's also important to have this as a function internally is to have one owner of it, which is, typically your corp dev head, so that there's not, information or questions flying around, that it's all quite centralized. And there's one kind of point of contact. And so that's really important, I think, to share as well. But it's usually just simply laying out the process. Like I said, every deal has nuances to it. If it's, different regulatory considerations you need to think about depending on your company or the type of company you're buying. And so there's no like hard and fast, I would say, rule that this is the exact process, but it's at a high level. The process is, and I share that back to, both the stakeholders and, as part of, my kind of education to the company. I would say on that part too, what's important for a process for others to know as well is, I've typically shared, what is corporate development and what does corporate development mean at, what company I'm at, with the broader company as well, the entire company, either through like a town hall or a lunch and learn, just so that everyone is aware at a high level what our roadmap looks like, what's interesting to us, what's our criteria, and what the process looks like in a very simple kind of document, so that it's it's pretty straightforward for folks to then be a part of as well. Obviously, there's anyone who's done a deal know that the deal's not usually straightforward, but for I think the broader community to understand how it works, I think is really helpful, because then they can when people are pitching you ideas or sharing ideas, they have some type of filter themselves too and know what the ensuing process will look like.
That's actually really interesting. So you will have these town halls or channels of broader communication to the general company, or is that just to management?
I've done these actually in both of the times that I've set up these functions. I've done a town hall with the entire company where I'll walk through what corporate development is, what the roadmap looks like, what's interesting to us. In some cases, I've walked through at a high level. What are deals we've looked at? What are interesting to us? And so that gives people a flavor for the types of companies that are worth pursuing potentially. And then usually from that, it'll become a little bit ad hoc where I'll get inbounds from folks across the company, which I actually really enjoy, across functions that I may not interact with typically, because like I said, they're interacting a lot with vendors and partners that I don't typically see sometimes. And so it's helpful to get these names even and to hear about companies that may not have passed my radar.
You turn the whole company into a crowdsource of opportunities.
They're all sourcing. Yep. Yeah.
Well, it's a cool thing too, because you're starting to get the culture of M&A established versus, oh, here we're buying this company, and then you're fighting uphill to get that culture established.
Yeah. Yep.
Do you, in that introduction, you mentioned a lot around the strategies and things of what you're hoping to achieve with it, and help understand the ideal type of companies. But the process itself, do you get into some of the fundamentals there when you speak broadly to those town halls?
Not usually. Like I said, a lot of these deals are quite nuanced and different, and there's no like hard and fast way of doing them. I will say though, when my current company, when we did announce an acquisition and we did walk through it with the company of how, what the thinking was, how we thought about it, how it was structured. And so I think at a high level in terms of the process, no, I don't get into it with the broader audience, but certainly, obviously, if and when a deal happens, I think it's really helpful to share that color with the company.
Okay. Well, we still have this outline that for people that want to get a general sense, here's how we think about M&A and act on it. What about when you get new people? And I'm even thinking about the early days of standing up a function. Maybe you got a few people familiar with it because they've done some founder-led or C-suite-led acquisitions. But I guess building that muscle up with especially the folks that have never done it before and getting them acclimated. How do you approach that?
I should say there are certainly folks in any company that have not either gone through an M&A process or done a deal at their company. But I think people are very curious. Like I said, people are excited about the potential for doing M&A. So we'll often get questions or, I'll have people, come up to me, in the office if we're in person of, just asking questions of, what I do, how it works. But yeah, it's not as much of a formalized process, of training every new person who doesn't know what M&A or hasn't gone through an M&A process before. And frankly, I think once you start looking at opportunities as a business and you do diligence on some of them to various degrees, depending on how far you go with the target, you are involving other folks at the company. And so people will start through that process as well, and going through diligence, know what it is like and be a part of that. And so I think the more times and the more reps you go through in terms of looking at businesses and targets, the more that becomes part of the culture of the company and people learn.
So they may initially be introduced in a passive way, but then as you do more deals, as they get into integrating companies, they essentially become more proactive.
Yep.
It's interesting because I'm always curious about that. Like it seems like that's a thing that definitely is a maturity curve for organizations to, and it seems like most of them do that. They basically do reps and get stronger at diligence integration. Yeah. Would you agree, or is that?
Yeah, totally. I think even if you've done M&A deals before, but if your business that you're at has not, it's still a new thing. And it's going through the reps of diligence, integration planning, and then actually, if you close the deal and do the deal, post-integration planning is huge learning for a business, especially the first one. And then you just get better at it over time and you develop your own processes and systems. So you might have had, done 5 deals at your last company, but every company is different. And so I think the important thing, and I think what's really great about growth stage companies, is you're nimble and you're flexible and you're able to adjust along the way.
Any shortcuts or things to reduce the learning curve around that?
That's a good question. I think one of the things I think about, especially when you're involving folks, outside of the C-suite and as part of your diligence process, is really having them be in the mindset of, when you're doing diligence, you should really be thinking about, if this were part of our business and this is something that we own and you'd have to either manage it or we have to manage it and run it. What do you need to know in order to do that? What do you need to see that's there or not there? And I think having that mindset of thinking 5 steps forward of, when this is our business, what do we need to know? I think really helps ask those questions during diligence and really push for those questions during diligence. Either see them or you don't see them there. I think, as one point I'd add to that is, I think, really important when you're doing diligence is to start already thinking of integration planning. Again, this is tied together what I was saying, but you can't just think of integration planning like post-deal close. You have to start that, frankly, when you're doing diligence, even before you sign a deal. I think it's really that this is why people say most M&A deals fail, is because, you sign the deal and you move on to the next thing, and you're not actually thinking about, how to integrate that company and how to achieve the targets that you had hoped to achieve through the deal. And so I think integration planning starts as part of, frankly, the diligence process.
What are the negative consequences if you don't do that?
It can be viewed as wasted time. There's a lot of time and energy put into the diligence processes. I think what's a few things that can help kind of counteract that, or that feeling of wasted time, is to, one, time bound it. A lot of these processes are time bound, whether intentionally or not, but I think it's really important to time bound it. So we have X days to kind of come to a decision or an agreement, 30, 60 days, whatever it might be. And then I think not view it as wasted time. I think it's important, even if this is the same that's true also for either an M&A professional or an executive team. If a deal falls apart or a deal doesn't happen, it's not wasted time. I don't think it's wasted time. I think it's important because you've won, like we were saying, more reps is always better, I think, for getting better clarity around objectives, how you guys are as a team are aligned on what's important for the business. And then also just, getting the process honed for your company. You go through a few of these, you get a pretty solid process in place going forward, and you tweak things along the way. And so I don't think it's wasted time. I also think it makes you smarter in future negotiations to have done a few of these, even if they haven't, been come to fruition or closed or been signed. And so I don't think it's wasted time. That being said, I'm sure folks at the company that are involved in diligence might feel like it's additional time spent on top of their day-to-day job. And so that I can understand, but I don't think it's wasted time at all for any organization.
Is that the goal, is to have those functional leads do diligence and integration planning at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, you obviously can't do a ton of integration planning before a deal is signed, and especially if there are certain regulatory approvals that you need to get done, obviously, between signing and closing. So there's like a somewhat of an arm's length that is needed between yourself and the target. But I think internally you can do a lot of integration planning of even just thinking about, from what how you can see the businesses combining. But I think it's, that obviously ramps over time between when you sign and when you close. And so when you actually do close, you have your day zero plan ready to go.
Well, I want to ask you on the front end part of getting these opportunities from the different sources. And it sounds like you got multiple sources since we create the advocacy group internally. I'm sure bankers are hitting you up with opportunities, especially since the brand name of the firm is growing like wildfire. How do you manage that? And then how do you sort of build this bandwidth to go after those companies that aren't for sale or actively trying to sell?
That's a good question. Yeah, there's a lot of, I would say, inbound channels, whether it's from, bankers or other kind of industry participants, or, frankly, there are a lot of internal channels as well, too. folks across, whether it's, our founders who are getting inbounds or folks across the business who are seeing opportunities. And so, in terms of managing it, I think what's important is that I don't think you necessarily have to, I would say, take every call or pursue every idea. I think you have to, over time, especially establish as part of the process is your criteria. And I think you can tell pretty quickly if something at least passes your initial criteria and is worth that conversation, given what you know about the business and your own business and what you know about the target business. So I think it's important to manage your own time, frankly, and to manage your own, your own function is to triage a bit and go after the ones and have those conversations with the opportunities that make sense and fit your criteria.
Is that how you structure it? You have ideal targets and they're prioritized, and sort of you allocate your time according to that? Because I feel like it's a long sales cycle to do an M&A deal, and there's a lot of nurturing involved.
There is certainly a lot of nurturing. I'm not necessarily a believer in having a target list and rank ordering them and having a, status update on each of those. I've done that before. I don't necessarily think it's the best way to manage this function. But I do think that it is important, obviously, to keep track of all the opportunities you're looking at or that you think are interesting. But I don't think, because again, your motivation is not just to get a deal done. I think, if you have a list or if you have a set of companies that you're either looking at or pursuing, just to align on, you focus on the ones that make sense for you and that pass, again, your criteria. I don't think, again, it's not just to be like, I talked to this company and we're this far along, so that I need to get this company that far along too, because if this one doesn't work, I need to get this one to work. It's not like that, where it's, that's a little bit actually of a banking mentality of, I need to close X deals and get X revenue by the end of the year. It's not that mentality at all. It's more of like, what passes your first criteria? When you look under the hood, what passes your second set? Do we want to get on the phone with them and talk with them? It's just, following things that make sense for your business, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And then you do, I'm curious if that part's actually documented, or how do you keep everybody on the same page on the qualification of these opportunities?
Yeah. So I've documented it before. I certainly have a, list of things that we've looked at, and, what our assessment. I think what's important, actually is less so the list, but what the assessment is or was, why it did or doesn't pass your criteria, because I think that's important to keep track of, because over time, new things will come up, new products will come up, new adjacencies will come up, and you might either forget or lose track of, not just, how you evaluated similar things before, but also what the perspectives were maybe a year or two ago, and be open to things maybe evolving. So I think the why, or, what I like to call, was there a there? If not, what was it? Just like the why it did or didn't work, I think is important to keep track of.
Do you spend a lot of time reaching out to these companies to convince them to sell?
No, I do not. I think I try to be a bit more opportunistic. Ones that are that we are serious about, we obviously reach out to. I think it's important too, as a, when you have a role like corporate development, if you reach out to a company to get to know them or to be introduced, sometimes they immediately assume you're going to buy them or immediately assume you want to buy them, and that's not always the case. And so I actually often don't lead the outreach myself, and I will do it through a partner in the business who might be more of a natural introduction, either on the partnership side or if it's a capability with that functional leader, just to get to know them a bit better before we jump to any conclusions. So I typically actually I'm not actively talking to a ton of companies at any given time.
And it's framed that way of, hey, I have a friend in Corp Dev, like to just make an intro and get to know your business a little better, something like that.
Yeah, in fact, I'm actually a little bit even one step removed from that. Is, hey, would love to get to know your business better, have read XYZ or think this is interesting. And then I'm including my partner or my colleague as well. So just to make it a bit more informal versus a formal, this is our head of M&A, because that can be a little either scary or exciting, I guess, depending on your business.
Awesome. I want to get back to our how to stand up an M&A function outline here.
Sure.
So step 3 was becoming an information hub. What does that mean?
Yeah, that's really, just being, like I said, in the flow of information as much as you can. So it's, reading the relevant, industry newsletters, reports that are coming out, et cetera. You know, I don't necessarily attend a lot of conferences, but if you find those to be helpful, attending conferences, I find the most value in having one-on-one conversations with various stakeholders, whether it's external or internal, like I said. And, externally, it's, again, bankers, consultants, even people that are maybe adjacently related to your business, I think find interesting and helpful as well. And just, keeping up with those conversations and over time.
Every company has a unique approach to it. And like you referenced, it's pretty unique to your company depending on your industry and those sources you follow. This information you gather, because you mentioned the stuff you share around, what does that look like? Like, how do you condense it and share it in a way that people actually get value out of it?
Yeah, and we're all about efficiency. And so I only typically play back to folks, or depending on what the information that's relevant or interesting is to the relevant folks, of, is there something interesting that I've learned or a potential opportunity that could be interesting for us? I'm not usually just providing market color that we can all read about in a newsletter. It's more of like, is there something interesting? And also what my perspective is on something. So if there's something worth talking about is when I usually play it back to folks. But otherwise, kind of in the day-to-day of having these conversations, there often isn't a ton that comes out of a specific conversation, but when there is, I certainly share it back. And again, like I said, importantly, like what my takeaway from it is and how it impacts or how it could impact our business.
Can we make up some examples? Is it like, hey, this competitor got acquired and here's whatever, some things of what it may mean to us, or what are some examples?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, it could be hey, this competitor is, fundraising, but it doesn't sound like it's going well because they haven't shown growth in XYZ markets. And so, well, let's see what happens for them and what that means. It doesn't necessarily even have to be in an M&A context, but that market color, even of they're trying to enter XYZ market and it's not going well, is interesting because we either might be in that market or might want to go to that market over time. So it's not even, again, like from an acquisition perspective, with just market color, that could be helpful. And so if that's the case, then I'll play it back and say, hey, we should monitor this or see what happens and what the results are when we get more information.
Yeah, I like that. Are there other examples of stuff you would pick out?
Yeah, I think, competitors that do get acquired or deals that do happen, I think getting market color on how the transaction transpired, whether it was in public company deals, you can read about it often, but in private company deals, there's not usually a lot of detail shared. And so getting that color of, they went through a process, they talked to X number of bidders. This was the feedback they got. They went with this bidder because of XYZ. I think that strategic rationale, I think, is probably the most interesting. That, and also typically in a private deal, how they landed on price, what multiples they looked at and what multiples they landed on. And so that color is interesting. And that usually is typically shared in conversations versus necessarily in public documents, especially for private company deals.
And then do you write this up as an email that you send out? Is there a frequency? Like, how does it get communicated? Is it just conference calls?
It's usually calls or Slack messages. It's not usually something more formal than that. It could even be, you're on a call and you bring it up as a talking point as well. So it depends on the stakeholders and the cadence in which, or the relevancy for them too, in what I've learned.
Okay. Let's see if you had a big enough corp dev, you could have somebody create the
Yeah, I
corp
think in a
dev
lot of the
newsletter.
bigger teams, yeah, with like the Microsofts of the world or those kinds of size of companies, they must have a monthly or biweekly newsletter or update or market color or commentary. I'm sure that they have, and maybe that's something over time that we do as well. But I don't typically like those, because I think sometimes when you have a monthly update or a quarterly update, you're forcing yourself to find content to put into that versus actually sharing relevant or helpful information.
It makes a lot of sense. Yeah, if you're big enough, hire a media resource to
Yeah,
create a production
exactly.
there.
Yeah.
Uh, I guess that's like M&A Science. We just start building a little
Yeah,
media
that's
business.
you.
The other step 4 in the process was alignment amongst stakeholders. Can you walk me through how do you turn that into a practical how-to?
Sure. I mean, getting alignment with stakeholders is there's no like playbook necessarily on that, but I think it's important, a really important part of the process. I think, I think everyone has to own the deal. If you're going to do a deal, everyone has to own the decision to do a deal. I think it's really critical for the company when you're pursuing something to do that. I think the downside of not having alignment is, 1 or 2 years post acquisition close, when things may not be going as well as you thought, or you're not hitting the targets you thought you were going to hit, is when, and people can say, well, I didn't want to do that deal in the first place, or I was never into it. That's a bad outcome. That's not what you want. You want people to be aligned up front and own either the good or bad that happens post close, and take accountability for that. And so that's why I think the alignment up front is important, so that there's no necessarily like, finger pointing or anything like that after. And that really is done whether it's so different and dependent on organization and leader. It can be done on a one-on-one basis. It can be done in a group setting. It really depends on the company, and the founding team. But I think it's critical, especially amongst the key executives, that everyone's aligned in a deal.
Is there a preferred format that you have?
I think it's important to actually not do it one-on-one. I think it's important to do it in a bit more of a group setting, so that people can hear other people's doubts or concerns and respond and react to them. And you can be a part of that process of either convincing people or not being able to convince people that it's the right thing to do. I think that's really helpful for everybody to observe and be a part of, and either work towards getting alignment in either way you go, right? It's important to get alignment to either do the deal or not do the deal. And being a part of that process is, I think, really critical for the executives.
What's the frequency of those specific meetings that happen as you progress through a deal?
They are pretty important, I think, early. I would say, like, not necessarily on the first stage, but once you kind of pass the initial, we're interested, we want to do this, I think it's really important to start getting that alignment, because pretty soon you're simultaneously thinking about, valuation and negotiating along the way. And I think that alignment is critical as you're doing that. You don't want to be to a point where you've aligned on a price and you're ready to put forward a term sheet when half your team is not on board with doing a deal. And so I think it has to be in conjunction with, I would say that, like, not first step, but the step right after.
So it sounds like the frequency would be pretty dynamic, that based on these sort of decision points, you may have a higher frequency of meetings, kind of have some critical information to make decisions around, and then
exactly. And then
out.
Also, and I would say important too is because typically you don't have entire alignment in the first meeting. And so I think it's important in those first meetings is to establish or play back of what are the gaps in getting that alignment. What are the things we need to figure out in order to either get alignment to do it or not to do it? Like, what are the data points we need? And then go gather those data points and play it back to folks, and then kind of progress to the next kind of thing or your next step to get alignment. And so I think just really clearly playing back of, like, what do you need to get to that alignment?
I wanted to go back to the overall, because when I think of a corp dev function as a team around this, where do you start with hiring a team? Like, what does that look like? Is that planned from the beginning, or is it shaped up as an ad-need basis?
So I think it really depends on the organization, and two really important things is, the first is how strong your finance or your strategic finance team is. And then the second is there, an athlete, or what I call an athlete, or the presence of athletes within your organization. And this is just people who have, a financial acumen, but also like a curiosity or wanting to learn about a business. It's typically former bankers and consultants in your business. I think if you have those things at your company, you don't necessarily need to immediately go and hire. I think it's, for me, I actually think it's important to, in both of the instances where I've stood up this function, I've had strong strategic finance teams that have athletes on them, and they're athletes of the organization. So I think it's really important to go through that process, and then see, as you're thinking about either doing more deals or maybe being even more proactive and adding kind of a bench for your team. What are the skill sets you need? If you have a strong strategic finance team, you don't necessarily need 5 bankers on your team, but you might want them if they're good at the other things as well. But I think it helps you narrow in on the skill sets you're actually looking for that can help you either do more deals or do larger deals or do deals in different geographies. That's also a way in which you can add to your team as well. People who have certain international or geographic expertise.
Okay, that's like a whole other interview that we can do just on the strategy of building up the people side of this
Yeah.
M&A function. What do you find to be the most challenging part of standing up a corp dev function?
I think the most challenging part to standing up a corporate development function can be sometimes of um, because the deals can be more opportunistic and maybe infrequent or seemingly infrequent. You're not, when you're in banking, you're working on 3-5 deals at one time in a good market. When you're internal, you may not be working on 3 or 5 things at a time. You might be looking at a few things. You likely are. Some might be in different stages of your focus, but it's not that I would say the same kind of deal. The abundance of deals that you're working on is not as high as it is in your banking. That's actually a good thing because you're focused and you're targeted. But I would say the uphill battle you might sometimes face is when you're adding to the team and you're looking to expand to the team of, well, we may not actually do a deal in this market or this geography for a year. So, why do we need someone today? That might be some of the pushback or feedback you'd get. And, obviously, I think this is true for any function when you're trying to build out a function and to grow a function, is to just show obviously what the roadmap looks like and how adding a person at whatever period of time, whether it's today or in 6 months from now, can help you to get to that deal and to execute that deal in 2 years' time. You always have to plan ahead for these things and in any function. And so I think that's important, and that's sometimes an uphill battle.
Yeah, it's like all the considerations around doing this. And I see that. And I also see that when it comes to standing up the IMO as well, where maybe it's ran through the function purely through centralized PMO, but then same thing. Like
It
that
really varies.
consideration around it.
Yeah.
What's the biggest lessons learned from your experience in doing this?
Oh, that's a good question. There's a lot that you learn along the way when you do these deals. I would say the first thing is, and this might sound obvious, but nothing ever goes according to plan. And it's really important, especially as the corporate development lead, is to be nimble and flexible. Know where you and your team's not limits are, but where your criteria and thresholds are, and know where you can push and not push. But just being flexible is really important. And the second thing is that a deal is never done until it's closed. I say this all the time. People sign a deal, announce it in the press, and go celebrate, which, great, celebrate then, but that's only step one. Things can always either be delayed, not necessarily go wrong, but just take different paths that you just don't anticipate. And so, as we've seen, even with the public M&A deals, with Twitter, et cetera, like things are just not done until it's closed. And I can't emphasize that enough. And then the final piece I would say is just that I've learned is just to maintain perspective. A lot of times deals can get heated, whether you're negotiating internally, externally, you have advisors, lawyers, consultants, et cetera. It can, you can get caught up in the almost theatrics of it. And I think it's really important to keep perspective that at the end of the day, none of us are curing cancer unless you're in a healthcare company, maybe. And you're, hopefully in most cases, the success of a deal does not make or break your own business. And so it's just a tool and a part of your growth. It doesn't, you will be hopefully fine if it doesn't happen. And so just keeping that perspective and when things can get heated, I think is really important.
Those are great takeaways.
Yeah.
And I need the most important takeaway. What's the craziest thing you've seen in M&A?
I've seen a lot. I probably can't share a lot of it publicly, but I
What's
would
it? We
say,
learned this. We just don't name names and dates, and you can pretty
yeah,
much tell
yeah,
everything else.
yeah. I would say it's founder relationships at a high level are really important and nuanced, both for the target that you're looking at, and then obviously also your own company. I think what I've learned along the way is understanding people's incentives and motivations is really important. And assuming, and hopefully this turns out to be true, that people are well intentioned, I think is really important. I think when when you go in with that mindset, things can go smoothly and you can kind of adjust and react to things that might come up. But founders care deeply about the businesses that they've created, and so it can lead to different reactions at different points of a deal. So I think it's really important to just assume people are well intentioned, and address concerns and needs along the way. I would say is my way of answering that question without getting into too many specifics.
Well, I'm wondering, is the crazy around that where it starts with misalignment there and then it sort of spirals out? Does that tend to be
Yeah,
where
you
the
know,
crazy comes in?
yeah, yeah. Sometimes, and in some cases, I've seen is if the target company has either multiple founders or very involved, board or investor and a founder. There's so many different iterations of this, but of aligning of why are you even talking to the acquiring company? What's the purpose? What do you want to gain out of this? Do you want to work at the acquiring company? Do you want to just get cash and move on? What is the motivation? And people typically don't have the same motivations, but that's okay. But aligning on, even why you're in the room to begin with, I think is really critical. And it sounds silly, but it's not often done, because people on both sides, like I said, get excited to be a part of a acquisition discussion. And so it's really important to have that alignment. And then also to, as the acquiring company, to be aware of that dynamic, and to, whether it's through one-on-one conversations or through just observing the way people interact with each other, I think is really important.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting too, of thinking of how much relationship building goes into getting a deal done. And I'm curious about how do you balance with what you described from really understanding a founder's intention with a professional approach to building the relationship versus a personal, when you go out and get somebody drunk to really understand who they are.
um, that's a great point. I think it's a combination of both. I think it's the everything we've talked about so far is the process, the criteria, the diligence, everything. All of those pieces are really important to keep. But the founder piece is also not just the alignment and understanding their alignment and what their motivations are, but just getting to know them as humans, going out to dinner, not necessarily having to get drunk with them, but just like sitting next to them and eating dinner, I think is really important. Just to know, because in most cases you want the founding team and the most of the employees to come work at your company after the acquisition. And so you should treat them like a potential future colleague, and you want to get to know them and know what motivates them, what their life is like, as much of that's interesting or relevant for you. I think it's really helpful. And also I think it makes the just acquisition talks, negotiating talks less confrontational, almost, of like, we're not this, or we may not, the acquiring company is not just like this big kind of, black box just trying to acquire you. And then, in maybe in some of the movies, like, slice and dice you and rip your business to pieces, or whatever it might be. It's like, we're all humans at the end of the day. And I think understanding people on a somewhat of a personal level too is important in going into these negotiating talks, and hopefully, integration talks, and then hopefully, post integration and post close talks as well. And when you're actually working together as a business.
I like how you distinguish the difference between getting dinner and getting drunk.
Those are
Veena,
two different things.
Veena, thank you so much for the time today. I enjoyed this conversation. Those of you still listening, till next time, here's to the deal.